Hey everyone, in this video, I want to talk about authentication. In the last video, I set up Cortex in more or less as little time as possible. I challenged myself to see how fast I could do it. And of course, I spent most of the video talking, but I got it down to probably about 15 minutes. In this video, I want to see how quickly I can set up authentication. I am going to use SAML, but I am going to cut a few corners. I'll talk about why that is in a second. Um, Hopefully, it'll still work. Otherwise, it'll make for a very interesting demo. Um, but before I do that, I want to remind everybody that every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, I host the Cortex users group. What it is it's basically office hours. It's time I set aside to talk to all of you. You're welcome to come. You're welcome to drop in when you have time. If you have time, you're welcome to just put it on your calendar and have it there as a resource. If you need it. It can be whatever you need it to be. It can be time for support. It can be time to see what I'm working on next. Ask me questions about the future of Cortex or about how to do something that you're trying to do with Cortex. Um, or we can just talk about the days that we're with Cherwell. That's fine too. Um, you can also ask your peers that show up as well. It's really meant to be very much a community oriented thing. And I hope it will continue to grow and evolve as the community grows and evolves, as Cortex grows and evolves, and if and as the needs of the event um, change. So with that, let's talk about authentication. So first, I want to start with the documentation site. This is the article that we were working from last time, um, and we basically went through it. I didn't go exactly linearly because there are some pieces that are kind of hurry up and wait, and I wanted to get on to the next piece. But there's certainly, sequential. You can go top to bottom. And I mentioned that we were just going to set authentication to none. Um, of course, in my documentation, I have an entire section devoted to authentication. I do mention the none uh, authentication mechanism and say you probably shouldn't do this for production. This should only be for demos, trials, or if you plan on handling authentication through some other means, um, like a reverse proxy in front of it, firewall rules, only people on the same machine can access, whatever. Um, but Cortex is designed to work really well with SAML, and I try to mimic the way Cherwell worked as much as possible. Um, so I'm not exactly going to follow any one of these documents to the letter. The one I'm following the closest is probably this one. Um, yeah, Okta has its own special configuration. It's probably the most similar to Azure AD. I'm actually using Keycloak. Um, Keycloak is really handy for me because I can set it up in a bunch of different ways um, and test both IDP and SP sides of the equation. Um, it's really handy for me for development, and it's actually what handles authentication for the demo site. And actually, I just recently switched that from using OpenID Connect to using SAML. I was having issues with the OpenID Connect setup. So SAML is definitely, absolutely the recommended way to go. If you're using something that isn't ADFS, Okta, Azure AD, or in my case, Keycloak, that doesn't mean it's not supported. It just means that the steps might not line up exactly the one to one with any of these documents. Um, so let's start the timer and get right to it. We'll just call it 5 minutes. I'll give myself, 10 seconds that I just wasted by talking. Um, but more or less going to follow this document. So I actually already have the equivalent piece of this set up in Keycloak. Um, and I think it's totally safe to show you what I've set up. So I'm using the archives demo, what Keycloak calls Realm. Um, this is basically the equivalent to like an ADFS server, or um, in Azure AD, it's like the tenant. So when you're creating like an enterprise application in Azure AD, the equivalent is just creating a client in the realm. So um, I've created a client, and you can see I've done this a couple times. Here's the SAML configuration for the demo site. Here's the SAML configuration for the VM that I'm using. By the way, here's the VM. It's still running Cortex in exactly the same state that we left off in the last video. Um, in fact, I'm recording these videos back to back. So there was like 20 seconds between stopping and record on the last one and starting to record on this one. Um, so here we have our client all set up. In Keycloak, this is create client, choose SAML. Client ID is actually the name of the URL that you're going to be running the service provider at. Why, I'm not sure, um, but that's how it's set up. Um, Okta, it's a little bit different. ADFS also, I think they call it entity ID, um, but that's what that needs to be. Login settings, I guess I have to hit next in order to, okay, sure, next. And then you specify, you can see I've specified a few in the past. Um, it's basically the root URL of the application. Home URL is the same thing. Valid redirect URIs is the same thing with an asterisk at the end. And then there is one piece of configuration that I needed to do in Keycloak to specify the SAML assertion URL. This is all very similar stuff to how it works in Cherwell. If your IDP doesn't use the service provider metadata, the XML metadata that Cherwell exports. You have to type all this stuff in manually. It's all the same stuff. Okay, so anyway, I think we've killed enough time. Let's go back to the documentation. So that's all that taken care of, which means that now it's time to specify some stuff in the app settings.json. IDP metadata URI, public URI, certificate validation mode. And in my case, I don't have to deal with number 3 because Keycloak allows me to configure some of that stuff on the IDP side. Um, and actually, the defaults just kind of work out that way. I'm also going to specify an additional setting, force authentication, which is equivalent to that authentication force checkbox in Cherwell. Yeah. All right. So let's do that. Let's go over here, and I'm gonna quick go to my cheat sheet over here, off camera. Go ahead and open up the app settings. All right, and here we go. Here's all the same stuff. I'm gonna switch this to SAML, and we're not going to specify a certificate file or a certificate password, but we are going to specify an IDP metadata URL, which is, for me, it's this. And the public URI is basically how I get to Cortex. So since I'm running it on the same machine, we'll just, I don't think that's going to work. I think I will have to hit it from a separate machine. So we're going to grab We're going to cheat. We're just going to grab that. That's what it's going to end up being. Paste that in there. Those are going to stay blank, like I said. And we need to specify, back to the documentation, certificate validation mode. And that is none. And force auth n, if I can spell it right, force auth n, that's going to be true. And make sure I have a valid JSON file. I've got commas at the ends of these lines, no comma at the end of that line. We are using SAML. All of this is set. We'll hit save. We'll restart. Okay, IIS is restarted. And now let's go back, grab this URL, and let's see if it works. Fingers crossed. All right. We get redirected to Keycloak. And 9 times out of 10, if you get this far, everything's set up correctly. Um, and if you don't get that far, you then you get to go figure out why. Cortex has a lot of good logging. Um, let me show you the documentation on that. This logging page has all sorts of good information about how to get more logs out of Cortex. Cortex does log when it's looking up the user and when it's looking at the security group. So you get all sorts of good information from that. We'll finish logging in here, and we should, yes, the information you're about to submit is not secure because I'm using HTTP, not HTTPS. You should absolutely use HTTPS. I didn't want to deal with certificates here, but you should do HTTPS. You should deal with certificates. That takes a little bit of time, but if you already have the certificates, that's part of your prep, and you'll probably be done dealing with authentication faster than this video because I've been talking a lot. So we'll just do send anyway, and ta-da, we're in. We're logged in, CSD admin, and we're logged in uh, as a um, as a SAML user. So there you go. Authentication all set up in 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. So more of the story. If you have all of the information ready to go and you have all the prerequisites taken care of, all of this setup takes no time at all. Of course, there are lots of potential gotchas when it comes to authentication. Um, my IDP and uh, Cortex just happen to already be expecting uh, usernames on both ends. If your IDP sends email addresses, that's easy enough to fix. Cortex has it's basically one switch that's in the documentation. It's lookup by, I believe, login by, lookup by, something along those lines. And uh, let's see, lookup by. You switch that to email, and boom, Cortex will use email addresses instead of usernames. Um, so I tried to make this super simple to configure, super simple to troubleshoot, um, and in most cases, it might just work out of the box. So again, fingers crossed for that. Um, I've spent enough time talking, but there was the demo in there too, so not a complete waste of time. Before I start rambling too much, I'm going to sign off. Hopefully this was helpful. If it was, give it a like. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Questions, leave them down in the comments below. And stay tuned for some hopefully pretty cool demos coming up in the next few weeks. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.